Sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it. Sometimes it comes in the form of a loyal dog refusing to let you pass by someone in need. 59-year-old rancher Boone Cavanaugh thought his caring days ended when he lost his wife. He'd built his life around routine and solitude, keeping the world at distance. But on a stormy evening, a wet dog blocked his path home, barking with urgent desperation. That dog led Boone to an abandoned cabin where he found Miss Lorna, his old piano teacher, barely alive and forgotten. She had collapsed alone, with no family, just this faithful companion who refused to give up. What Boone didn't know was that saving her would save him too. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Cavanaugh ranch, painting the Montana grassland in shades of gold that would have taken Sarah's breath away. Boone twisted the worn wedding band around his finger, a habit that had become as automatic as breathing in the 3 years since she'd been gone. The ring had grown loose on his weathered hand, but he couldn't bring himself to resize it, much less remove it. Some things, he'd learned, weren't meant to change. He stood on the wraparound porch of the house Sarah had insisted they build together, watching his small herd of cattle move lazily across the pasture. The morning ritual never varied. Coffee at 5:30, check the weather, scan the land, and plan a day that would mirror yesterday and tomorrow. Predictability had become his armor against a world that had proven itself capable of devastating surprises. The ranch house sat like a monument to better times, its cedar siding weathered to a comfortable gray that blended with the surrounding mountains. Sarah had chosen every detail. The wraparound porch, where they'd spent countless evenings, the large windows that invited the landscape inside, the kitchen garden that now grew wild with neglect. Boone maintained the structure with meticulous care, but the soul of the place had died with her. "Morning, Boone." Pete's voice carried across the yard as the ranch hand emerged from the barn, his aging Australian cattle dog Rex trotting beside him. Pete Hernandez had worked the Cavanaugh land for 15 years, long enough to remember when laughter echoed from the house and Sarah's voice could be heard humming while she tended her roses. Pete. Boone's acknowledgement was cordial but distant. He'd grown skilled at conversations that revealed nothing, friendships that demanded little. Pete had tried, in the months after Sarah's funeral, to draw him back into the rhythm of normal human interaction. But Boone had retreated so far into himself that even well-meaning gestures felt like intrusions. The two men went about their morning tasks with practiced efficiency. Feed needed to be distributed, fence lines checked, machinery maintained. The work was honest and demanding, requiring enough physical attention to quiet the mind's tendency toward darker territories. Boone had discovered that exhaustion could be a friend. Tired bodies meant dreamless sleep, and dreamless sleep meant fewer visits from ghosts. As they worked, Pete filled the silence with updates about the cattle, the weather forecast, and county news. His words washed over Boone like background music, present but not particularly meaningful. It wasn't that Boone disliked his employee. Pete was reliable, competent, and respectfully undemanding. But every conversation felt like an effort, every social interaction a reminder of how far he'd drifted from the man Sarah had loved. "Doc Martinez stopped by yesterday while you were in town," Pete mentioned as they secured feed in the barn. "Said to tell you his offer still stands if you need any help with the herd." Dr. Ricardo Martinez had been the local veterinarian for 25 years, serving ranchers across 3 counties with a combination of medical expertise and genuine care that extended well beyond the animals he treated. He and Sarah had been friends since her arrival in Montana, bonded by their shared commitment to nurturing growing things. After her death, Doc Martinez had made regular attempts to maintain connection with Boone, understanding that grief could isolate a person as surely as any physical barrier. "Don't need help," Boone replied. The same response he'd given to dozens of similar offers over the past 3 years. Independence had become his religion, self-reliance his practice. Accepting help meant acknowledging need, and acknowledging need meant admitting that some holes couldn't be filled by stubbornness and solitude. The morning passed in comfortable routine until the wind began to shift. Boone noticed it first as a change in temperature, then as a restlessness among the cattle. The sky, which had promised a clear day, began gathering clouds along the western horizon. Weather in Montana could turn with little warning, transforming peaceful afternoons into battles against nature's sudden moods. "Looks like we might get that storm system they've been talking about," Pete observed, shading his eyes to study the approaching clouds. "Radio said it could be a big one." Boone nodded, already calculating what needed to be secured. Storms demanded respect in ranch country, where isolation meant self-reliance extended to emergency preparedness. Loose equipment needed to be tied down, animals moved to shelter, and contingency plans activated. It was the kind of crisis management that had once involved two people working in perfect coordination, Sarah anticipating his moves while he anticipated hers. By midday, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the western sky had darkened to an ominous slate gray. Pete finished securing the last of the loose equipment and headed home to his own place, 5 miles down the valley, leaving Boone to face the approaching storm alone. The silence that followed Pete's departure felt heavier than usual, charged with the electrical tension that preceded serious weather. Boone spent the afternoon moving cattle to protected areas and double-checking the security of gates and fences. The physical work felt good, purposeful in a way that much of his life had ceased to feel. There was something reassuring about preparing for a storm. It was a concrete challenge with clear solutions, unlike the amorphous grief that resisted all his attempts at management. As evening approached, the wind began to howl through the mountains with increasing intensity. Boone made a final tour of the property, his practiced eye noting anything that might become problematic in heavy weather. The storm was clearly going to be significant, the kind that tested both preparation and resolve. He returned to the house as the first fat raindrops began to fall, each one carrying the promise of the deluge to come. The empty rooms felt larger during storms, as if the weather emphasized the absence of voices and footsteps that had once filled the space. Sarah had loved storms, finding them dramatic and cleansing. She would have insisted on watching from the kitchen window, commenting on the lightning's beauty and the rain's necessity for her garden. Boone settled into his evening routine with the mechanical precision that had sustained him through countless similar nights. Dinner was simple and solitary, eaten while standing at the kitchen counter and listening to the weather reports on the radio. The storm system was indeed significant, with predictions of heavy rain, strong winds, and possible flooding in low-lying areas. After cleaning up, he sat in his leather chair in the living room, the same chair where he'd spent countless evenings reading, while Sarah worked on her needlepoint or planned her garden. The house creaked and groaned under the assault of wind and rain, familiar sounds that had once provided comfort but now seemed to emphasize his solitude. The wedding ring caught the lamplight as he reached for the evening paper, its worn surface reflecting years of shared meals, held hands, and quiet moments that had seemed ordinary at the time, but now felt precious beyond measure. He'd bought the ring 41 years ago, with money earned from his first job after college, when the future had seemed full of unlimited possibility, and Sarah had been the answer to every question he'd ever asked. Outside, the storm intensified, battering the windows and sending rain in horizontal sheets across the landscape. Boone knew from experience that such storms could last hours, transforming familiar roads into treacherous obstacles and turning routine journeys into adventures. But tomorrow he would need supplies from town, storm or no storm. The pantry was running low, and independence meant never being caught unprepared. As he prepared for bed, the wind howled with increasing ferocity, rattling the windows and causing the lights to flicker occasionally. The house felt like a ship riding out a gale, solid but vulnerable to forces beyond human control. Boone had weathered many such storms with Sarah, finding comfort in shared concern and mutual dependence. Now the storms felt like battles to be endured, rather than experiences to be shared. He lay in bed, listening to the rain drum against the roof, the wedding band still circling his finger like a talisman against further loss. Tomorrow would bring the aftermath. Downed branches, washed-out sections of road, and the kind of cleanup that reminded ranchers of their place in nature's larger scheme. But tonight, there was only the storm and the memories it stirred. The sound of rain, that Sarah had always said, sounded like applause for the earth's endless capacity for renewal. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by particularly loud gusts of wind and the creaking protests of a house under siege. In his dreams, Sarah's voice mingled with the storm's fury, her words lost in the noise, but her presence as real as the rain beating against the windows. When morning came, Boone would face the storm's legacy and make the decisions that would lead him down a muddy road toward an encounter that would change everything. But for now, there was only the night and the storm and the worn gold band that connected him to a love that had survived even death. The morning after the storm dawned grey and sodden, with the kind of persistent drizzle that promised to last well into the afternoon. Boone saddled Thunder, his 12-year-old quarter horse, and prepared for the ride to town that couldn't be postponed another day. The truck had developed a concerning rattle in the transmission, and until Pete could look at it properly, the horse would have to serve for essential errands. Thunder picked his way carefully along the muddy road, his hooves finding purchase on patches of gravel that hadn't been completely washed away by the night's deluge. The familiar route to town had been transformed into a challenging obstacle course of standing water. Fallen branches and sections where the road had been carved into deep ruts by rushing runoff as they approached the old Jameson mill, abandoned for 15 years but still standing like a sentinel over the valley. Boone noticed something unusual ahead. A dog stood squarely in the middle of the road, a medium-sized mutt with blue heeler markings and a coat soaked through to the skin. Most animals would have sought shelter during such weather, but this one planted himself with unmistakable determination. "Move along," Boone called, expecting the dog to scatter, as most strays did when confronted by horse and rider. Instead, the animal began barking with an urgency that seemed to demand attention rather than express fear. The dog's stance was purposeful, his alert eyes fixed not on Thunder, but directly on Boone himself. Thunder snorted and sidestepped, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Boone dismounted with irritation, his boots squelching in the mud as he approached the stubborn animal. "Go on, get out of here," he said, waving his arms in the universal gesture for encouraging unwanted creatures to move along. The dog stopped barking but didn't retreat. Instead, he approached Boone with careful steps, his tail low but not tucked in fear. When he was close enough, the animal gently but firmly grasped Boone's pants leg in his teeth and began to pull, not aggressively, but with clear intent. What the hell? Boone tried to shake the dog loose, but the animal's grip was steady and his message unmistakable. Something was wrong, and this dog needed Boone to follow him. Against his better judgment and every instinct that had kept him isolated for 3 years, Boone allowed himself to be led off the road toward a narrow path that wound through a copse of cottonwoods. The dog released his pants leg and trotted ahead, stopping every few yards to ensure Boone was still following. The path led to a small cabin that Boone remembered as belonging to the old Hendricks place. He'd assumed it had been abandoned years ago when Martha Hendricks moved to live with her daughter in Billings. The structure looked weathered and neglected, its porch sagging under the weight of accumulated debris, but there were signs of recent habitation, a few pieces of laundry still hanging limply from a line, a small pile of split wood stacked near the door. The dog bounded up the porch steps and began scratching at the door, whimpering with obvious distress. The door stood slightly ajar, unusual for anyone concerned about security or keeping the weather out. Through the gap, Boone could see into a dim interior where something was clearly amiss. He pushed the door open wider and stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the low light. The cabin's interior was sparse but clean, furnished with pieces that spoke of careful maintenance, despite obvious age. But it was what lay scattered across the floor that stopped him cold. Sheets of piano music, yellowed with age and dampened by rain that had blown through the open door. Chopin etudes, Bach inventions, Mozart sonatas, the classical pieces that had formed the backbone of his musical education 4 decades ago. His eyes followed the scattered sheet music to its source, and his heart nearly stopped. Collapsed beside an old upright piano lay an elderly woman, unconscious and barely breathing. Even after 40 years, he recognized the delicate features and silver hair of Miss Lorna Weatherby, the piano teacher who had patiently guided his teenage fingers through countless scales and arpeggios. Miss Lorna. The name escaped his lips before conscious thought could stop it. She looked fragile as paper, her skin pale and her breathing shallow. Her dress was soaked through, and she felt cold to the touch when he knelt beside her and checked for a pulse. It was there, weak but steady, and she stirred slightly at his touch. The dog immediately positioned himself beside the unconscious woman, his wet nose nudging her hand as if trying to wake her through sheer determination. The animal's coat was soaked, and Boone realized he must have been standing guard in the storm, refusing to abandon his post despite the brutal weather. Boone's mind raced through possibilities. Miss Lorna had been missing from the community for years. Most people assumed she'd moved away after her husband died. To find her here, living alone in this neglected cabin with only a loyal dog for company, was a shock that penetrated even his carefully maintained emotional barriers. She opened her eyes briefly, focusing on his face with obvious confusion. "Boone?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Little Boone Cavanaugh? Is that really you?" "Yes, ma'am, it's me." The childhood habit of respectful address came back automatically. "You're going to be okay. I'm going to get you help." Her eyes fluttered closed again, but not before he saw a flicker of relief cross her features. She had recognized him, this woman who had spent countless afternoons trying to teach him that music was about more than just hitting the right keys at the right time. She talked about expression, about putting your heart into the performance, about music as a language for emotions too complex for words. The scattered sheet music around her body told a story of collapse. She'd been at the piano when whatever happened happened. Some of the sheets showed water damage that was older than last night's storm, suggesting the roof had been leaking for some time. The cabin was clearly in poor condition, and Miss Lorna was obviously living in circumstances that bordered on desperate. The dog whined softly and licked the unconscious woman's hand, his devotion absolute despite the dire circumstances. Boone found himself moved by the animal's loyalty, recognizing something in the dog's unwavering commitment that he'd once felt but had buried under years of protective isolation. He gathered Miss Lorna carefully in his arms, surprised by how little she weighed. She'd always been petite, but now she felt almost weightless, as if grief and hardship had worn her down to her essential self. Her breathing was labored, and he could feel heat radiating from her skin that suggested fever. The dog followed closely as Boone carried her outside, clearly unwilling to be separated from his charge. Thunder waited patiently despite the unusual circumstances, trained to stand ground-tied in all but the most extreme situations. Getting an unconscious woman onto horseback was going to be a challenge, but there was no other option for getting her to medical attention quickly. Boone managed to lift Miss Lorna onto Thunder's saddle, supporting her weight against his chest as he mounted behind her. The dog immediately began following, his determination to stay with his human, touching something in Boone's chest that he'd thought was permanently closed. "Come on then," he called to the dog, whose tail wagged briefly at the invitation before he fell into step beside the horse. The ride to town was treacherous under the best of circumstances, but carrying an unconscious woman through mud and standing water while a determined dog trotted alongside required every bit of Boone's horsemanship skills. Miss Lorna drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring words he couldn't quite catch, as Thunder carried them slowly toward help. Boone found himself remembering piano lessons in the Weatherby house on Maple Street, the smell of furniture polish and the sound of the metronome. Miss Lorna's patient corrections when his technique grew sloppy, a genuine pleasure when he finally mastered a difficult passage. She'd been more than a teacher. She'd been one of the few adults who seemed to understand that beneath his teenage awkwardness lay genuine sensitivity. The scattered sheet music back at the cabin had triggered memories he'd kept carefully buried, not just of piano lessons, but of a time when he'd believed that beauty and art mattered, when music had seemed like a doorway to something larger than himself. Finding Miss Lorna collapsed and forgotten had cracked something open in his chest, and he wasn't sure he could force it closed again. The dog kept pace, despite the difficult terrain, never falling behind or losing focus on his unconscious companion. As they finally reached the outskirts of town, Boone realized that this morning had changed something fundamental. For the first time in 3 years, someone else's crisis had become more important than his own careful isolation. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the simple routine that had protected him from caring too much about anyone or anything. The dog had made sure of that, and so had the scattered piano music that had reminded him of who he used to be, before grief taught him that caring was just another word for vulnerability. The valley's small medical clinic occupied a converted house on the main street, its modest size belying the critical role it played in serving the scattered population of ranchers and townspeople. Dr. Martinez had been expecting a routine morning when Boone Cavanaugh appeared in the doorway carrying an unconscious elderly woman, followed by a soaking wet dog that clearly refused to be separated from his charge. "Ricardo, I need help," Boone said, the first time in 3 years he'd asked anyone for assistance with anything. The words felt strange in his mouth, rusty from disuse. Dr. Martinez took one look at the situation and immediately cleared his examination table, his trained eyes assessing the woman's condition, even as Boone carefully transferred her from his arms. "What happened?" "Found her collapsed in the old Hendricks cabin. This is Miss Lorna Weatherby. Used to teach piano in town years back. She's been unconscious on and off during the ride here." The dog positioned himself in the corner where he could watch the proceedings without interfering, his intelligent eyes tracking every movement around his human. Dr. Martinez noted the animal's obvious devotion and decided not to enforce the usual no pets policy under the circumstances. "Lorna Weatherby," Dr. Martinez repeated, checking her pulse and breathing with practiced efficiency. "I remember her. Haven't seen her in, must be 8 years now. Everyone assumed she'd moved away after her husband passed. Apparently not." Boone stepped back to give the doctor room to work, but his eyes remained fixed on Miss Lorna's pale face. She looked even more fragile under the clinic's bright lights, her breathing shallow and her skin carrying an unhealthy flush that suggested fever. Dr. Martinez worked with quiet competence, taking vital signs and conducting a preliminary examination. "She's dehydrated and running a significant fever. Pneumonia, most likely, and it looks like she's been fighting it for some time." "How long has she been living in that cabin?" "I don't know. The place looked like it had been occupied for months, maybe longer." Boone found himself studying the hospital bracelet Dr. Martinez fastened around Miss Lorna's thin wrist, a simple plastic band that somehow made her situation feel even more desperate. The space for emergency contact information remained blank, a stark reminder of her isolation. "No family?" Dr. Martinez asked, following Boone's gaze to the bracelet. "None that I know of. Her husband died years ago, and I don't remember her ever mentioning children." The realization settled over Boone like a weight. Miss Lorna had been living completely alone, with no safety net, no one to check on her welfare or notice when she failed to appear for daily routines. Dr. Martinez inserted an IV line with practiced skill, beginning fluid replacement while Miss Lorna drifted between consciousness and sleep. When she was awake, her eyes held a combination of confusion and embarrassment that suggested she was aware of her helpless condition but unable to do anything about it. "Boone," she whispered during one of her clearer moments, her voice papery with dehydration. "Is that really you? You've gotten so tall." He found himself smiling despite the circumstances. "Yes, ma'am, it's me. You're going to be fine now. I was trying to play," she continued, her words slightly slurred from fever. "The Chopin, you remember the Chopin? You never could get the left hand." "Right, I remember." The memory surfaced. Unbidden, countless afternoons struggling with the intricate fingering of Chopin's etudes, while Miss Lorna patiently counted time and corrected his posture. She'd never lost her temper, never made him feel stupid for his mistakes, always finding something to encourage, even in his most clumsy attempts. Dr. Martinez caught Boone's eye and gestured toward his office. They stepped away from the examination table, though the dog remained steadfast in his corner vigil. "She needs to be in the hospital in Billings," Dr. Martinez said quietly. "This level of dehydration and pneumonia requires more intensive care than I can provide here. But there's another problem. She'll need someone to authorize treatment, someone to handle the financial arrangements. Does she have insurance, savings, any kind of support system?" Boone felt an uncomfortable knot forming in his stomach. "I have no idea. Like I said, everyone assumed she'd moved away. I haven't spoken to her since I was 17 years old. Well, someone needs to figure it out, and quickly. I can stabilize her condition temporarily, but she needs more aggressive treatment than this clinic can provide." The dog whined softly from his corner, as if sensing the gravity of the discussion. Boone looked at the animal, clearly well cared for despite the circumstances, obviously devoted to Miss Lorna, refusing to abandon his post even in unfamiliar surroundings. "What's the dog's story?" Boone asked. "Blue heeler mix, well-trained, probably 8 or 9 years old. He's been standing guard over her. Must have been in that cabin with her during the worst of the storm last night. Dogs like that don't develop that kind of loyalty overnight." Boone studied the dog more carefully, noting the intelligence in his eyes and the way he positioned himself to watch both Miss Lorna and the clinic entrance simultaneously. This was an animal that understood responsibility, that had appointed himself as protector and refused to abandon his duty. "I'll take care of the arrangements," Boone heard himself say, the words surprising him as much as they clearly surprised Dr. Martinez. "The hospital costs, the insurance questions, whatever needs to be sorted out." Dr. Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Boone, that's generous, but hospital care can be expensive. Are you sure you want to take on that kind of responsibility for someone you haven't seen in decades?" The question hung in the air between them. Boone looked at Miss Lorna, lying vulnerable and alone, except for a devoted dog and a former student who'd found her by accident. The blank emergency contact line on her hospital bracelet seemed to symbolize everything wrong with a world where people could simply disappear from community consciousness. Forgotten until crisis made their existence impossible to ignore. "She taught me piano for 4 years," Boone said finally. "Never missed a lesson, never lost patience with me, never made me feel like my fumbling attempts at music were wasting her time. If she needs help now, the least I can do is make sure she gets proper medical care." The truth was more complex than that, involving memories of Sarah's frequent mentions of community responsibility and the way she'd always insisted that caring for others was what separated civilization from mere survival. But that explanation felt too raw, too connected to grief he wasn't ready to examine. Dr. Martinez nodded slowly. "All right then. I'll make the arrangements for transport to Billings. It'll be a few hours before the ambulance can get here. The storm last night created some road problems. Can you stay with her until then?" "Yes." The answer came without hesitation, though Boone couldn't quite identify what motivated his certainty. "And the dog?" "The dog can ride in your truck. I have a feeling he's not going to be separated from her willingly, and hospital policies aside, sometimes the best medicine isn't found in any pharmaceutical guide." Boone settled into the chair beside Miss Lorna's examination table, the dog immediately moving closer to maintain his protective vigil. For the first time in 3 years, Boone found himself responsible for someone else's welfare, committed to a course of action that had nothing to do with ranch maintenance or personal survival. Miss Lorna's breathing gradually improved as the IV fluids did their work, and her fever began to respond to medication. During her lucid moments, she squeezed Boone's hand with surprising strength, her eyes showing gratitude that needed no words. The hospital bracelet caught the afternoon light streaming through the clinic windows, its blank contact information a reminder that some forms of poverty had nothing to do with money. Miss Lorna had been living without the safety net of community connection, invisible until crisis forced her back into visibility. As they waited for the ambulance, Boone found himself making mental calculations about hospital costs and insurance complications, responsibilities he'd never expected to shoulder. But looking at the devoted dog and the fragile woman who'd once taught him that music could express what words could not, he discovered that some obligations chose you rather than the other way around. The hospital room in Billings smelled of antiseptic and institutional efficiency, a sterile environment that seemed to diminish Miss Lorna's already fragile presence. She'd been unconscious for most of the ambulance ride, but the IV fluids and antibiotics were beginning to work their restorative magic. Boone sat in the visitor's chair, the dog curled at his feet, a privilege granted by sympathetic staff who recognized the therapeutic value of unwavering loyalty. When Miss Lorna finally opened her eyes fully, her gaze was clearer than it had been since he'd found her. She studied his face with the careful attention of someone trying to reconcile memory with reality, her fingers plucking at the hospital blanket as if searching for something familiar. "You really are Boone Cavanaugh," she said, her voice still weak but more focused. "My goodness, you've become quite the handsome man. You always were such a serious boy." "Yes, ma'am. Though I go by my given name now, Boone, not the little Boone you used to call me." A smile ghosted across her features. "I remember when you first came to me for lessons. You were 14, and your mother insisted you needed cultural refinement. You acted like learning piano was a form of punishment." The memory surfaced with unexpected vividness, his teenage self slouching on Miss Lorna's piano bench, convinced that music lessons were a waste of time that could be better spent fishing or working on his father's ranch. She'd been patient with his resistance, gradually drawing out a genuine appreciation for melody and rhythm that he'd never acknowledged to his friends. "I was a difficult student," he admitted. "Not difficult, guarded. You had such emotion locked away inside. I could hear it trying to get out when you played. But you fought against it. Music requires vulnerability, and vulnerability was something you weren't ready to risk." Her words carried more insight than comfort. Even at 14, he'd been building the emotional walls that would serve him through decades of ranch life, and eventually, through the devastating grief of losing Sarah. Miss Lorna had recognized his tendency towards self-protection long before he'd understood it himself. She reached toward the bedside table with obvious effort. "Could you hand me my purse? There's something I'd like to show you." The purse was worn leather, clearly cared for but showing years of use. Miss Lorna's hands trembled slightly as she searched through its contents, finally extracting a faded photograph that she held out to him with obvious pride. The photograph showed a younger Miss Lorna and her late husband standing behind a group of piano students arranged around an upright piano. Boone recognized the setting as her old house on Maple Street, the living room where he'd spent countless afternoons struggling with scales and arpeggios. But it was the faces that caught his attention. 8 young people, himself among them, all wearing the slightly embarrassed expressions of teenagers posing for a formal photograph. "Spring recital 1983, Miss Lorna said. "Do you remember? You played the Fur-Elise that your mother requested, though I know you wanted to attempt something more challenging." Boone studied his teenage self in the photograph, gangly, serious, standing slightly apart from the other students, as if reluctant to fully commit to group membership. But Miss Lorna's hand rested on his shoulder in the picture, a gesture that suggested affection and encouragement, despite his obvious discomfort. "You kept this all these years?" "I kept photographs of all my students." Music teachers don't have children the way other people do. We have students. And you were some of my favorites." Her voice carried a wistfulness that spoke of a life measured in other people's accomplishments rather than personal achievements. The photograph revealed something Boone hadn't fully appreciated at the time. Miss Lorna and her husband had created a kind of extended family through their music students, nurturing young talent and celebrating modest achievements as if they were concert hall triumphs. The living room piano had been the center of their universe, the focal point around which they'd built a life of service to their community's cultural development. "What happened, Miss Lorna? How did you end up in that cabin living alone?" Her expression shifted, pride giving way to something more vulnerable. "After Harold died, my husband, I discovered that our finances weren't what I'd believed. The music lessons provided some income, but not enough to maintain the house. I had to sell it and most of our belongings with it." She paused, gathering strength for the more difficult part of the story. "My sister Martha owned the cabin. When she passed 2 years ago, she left it to me. It seemed like a gift, a place to live without rent or mortgage payments, but the cabin's in terrible condition. The roof leaks, the porch is falling down." "I know." Her voice carried quiet dignity despite the circumstances. "I've been trying to make repairs with what little money I have, but everything costs more than I can afford. The dog, Blue, he belonged to Martha. He's been my only companion since I moved there." The dog's ears perked at the sound of his name, his tail thumping once against the hospital floor. The animal's devotion made more sense now. He'd been caring for Miss Lorna as a continuation of his loyalty to her deceased sister, adapting his protective instincts to a new charge who clearly needed his vigilance. "Do people in town know you're back?" Boone asked. Miss Lorna's cheeks flushed slightly. "I haven't exactly announced my presence. It's embarrassing. You understand. Coming back under such reduced circumstances when people remember you as the respectable piano teacher with the nice house on Maple Street." The revelation cut deeper than Boone had expected. Miss Lorna had been living in isolation partly from necessity, but also from pride, unable to seek help from a community that remembered her in better circumstances. Her absence from town life hadn't been noticed because she'd deliberately remained invisible, shopping for necessities during off hours and avoiding social situations where her changed status might be observed. "You should have asked for help," Boone said, though even as the words left his mouth, he recognized the irony. He'd spent 3 years avoiding exactly the kind of community connection that might have provided support during his own crisis. "Pride is a luxury I couldn't afford, but it was the one thing I couldn't bring myself to abandon," Miss Lorna replied with a rueful smile. "Foolish, perhaps, but there you have it." The afternoon light filtering through the hospital window illuminated the photograph still clutched in her hands, highlighting the faces of students who had moved on to adult lives while their teacher gradually disappeared from community consciousness. Boone wondered how many of the other people in the picture would even remember Miss Lorna's influence on their early musical development. "The recital," he said, pointing to the photograph. "I do remember it. You made us all feel like we were performing at Carnegie Hall instead of in your living room. Every performance matters," Miss Lorna said, echoing words she'd spoken countless times during lessons. "Music isn't about perfect technique. It's about expressing something true. You understood that eventually, even if you pretended not to care." Blue stretched and repositioned himself closer to the bed, his presence a constant reminder of the devotion that had saved Miss Lorna's life. Without the dog's determined intervention, she might have died alone in that cabin, her disappearance from the world going unnoticed until someone eventually discovered her remains. As visiting hours drew to a close, Boone found himself reluctant to leave. The photograph had triggered memories of a time when his life had included music and beauty, when artistic expression had seemed important enough to justify the vulnerability it required. Miss Lorna represented a connection to his younger self, the version of Boone Cavanaugh who had believed that caring deeply about something was worth the risk of loss. "I'll be back tomorrow," he promised, surprised by how much he meant it. "Blue can stay at the ranch until you're well enough to—" He stopped, realizing he had no idea what Miss Lorna's discharge plans might involve. "Until I'm well enough to return to that cabin," she finished gently. "It's the only home I have." The words hung between them, a reminder of the practical problems that medical treatment couldn't solve. Miss Lorna needed more than antibiotics and IV fluids. She needed a place to live that wouldn't kill her. But her options appeared limited by circumstances beyond her control. As Boone gathered his things to leave, the faded photograph remained on Miss Lorna's bedside table, a tangible connection to better times and younger selves. It seemed to promise that some relationships could survive decades of separation, that teachers and students remained linked by bonds that transcended the immediate circumstances of education. The dog followed him reluctantly, clearly torn between loyalty to Miss Lorna and the practical necessity of accepting temporary care from her rescuer. As they left the hospital together, Boone realized that saving Miss Lorna had committed him to responsibilities he'd never anticipated, obligations that extended far beyond emergency medical care. The daily visits to the hospital became a routine that surprised Boone with its natural rhythm. Each morning, after completing essential ranch work, he would make the 40-mile drive to Billings with Blue riding shotgun in the passenger seat, the dog's excitement building as they approached familiar territory. Miss Lorna's condition improved steadily under professional medical care, but her spirits seemed to lift most noticeably when her visitors arrived. During their conversations, she shared stories that filled gaps in Boone's understanding of the community he'd withdrawn from. She spoke of former students who'd become teachers themselves, of marriages and divorces, births and deaths, the ordinary drama of small-town life that continued whether or not one chose to participate. Her knowledge of local history ran deep, reaching back to the settlement days when her own grandparents had homesteaded in the valley. "Your Sarah used to visit me regularly," Miss Lorna mentioned during one afternoon visit, the statement catching Boone completely off guard. This was before she became ill, of course. "She brought me vegetables from her garden, and we'd have tea and talk about music. She had such appreciation for Chopin's nocturnes." The revelation hit Boone like a physical blow. In all their years of marriage, Sarah had never mentioned visiting Miss Lorna, had never indicated that she'd maintained contact with his former piano teacher. The omission felt significant, though he couldn't quite understand why. "She never told me," he said quietly. "Sarah was very private about her charitable activities. She didn't want recognition. She simply saw need and responded to it. We had lovely conversations about gardening and music, about the way both required patience and faith in future growth." Boone left the hospital that afternoon, with his mind churning through implications he'd never considered. If Sarah had been visiting Miss Lorna regularly, why had she never mentioned it? What other community connections had his wife maintained while he'd gradually withdrawn into ranch-focused isolation? That evening, restless and unsettled, he found himself in Sarah's study, a small room off the kitchen that he'd avoided for 3 years. Her books remained on the shelves exactly as she'd left them. Her desk still held papers and notes from her final weeks. But it was the garden journal that drew his attention, a leather-bound notebook where she'd recorded planting schedules, weather observations, and philosophical reflections on the meaning of cultivating growing things. He opened the journal with trembling hands, expecting to find only agricultural notations. Instead, he discovered entries that revealed a side of his wife he'd never fully appreciated. "Visited Lorna Weatherby today. She's struggling more than she admits, but too proud to ask for help directly. Brought her tomatoes and green beans. She always appreciates fresh vegetables, and I suspect they supplement her limited grocery budget." We talked about Boone's piano lessons. She remembers him as a talented but guarded student, quick to learn but reluctant to express emotion through music. "He had such feeling locked away," she said. "I always hoped life would teach him to let it out." I think she understood him better than we realized. The entry was dated 8 months before Sarah's cancer diagnosis. Boone turned pages with increasing amazement, finding regular mentions of Miss Lorna interspersed with gardening observations. Sarah had been providing quiet support for years, bringing food, offering companionship, even helping with small repairs around the Maple Street house. Another entry. Dated just 6 months before Sarah's death, Lorna's situation is becoming more desperate. Harold's medical bills consumed their savings, and she's too proud to apply for assistance programs. She talks about selling the house and moving somewhere cheaper, but I don't think she has anywhere to go. I wish Boone and I could do more, but she'd be mortified if she knew I was discussing her circumstances with anyone. Some people need help but can't. Bear to be seen needing it. The journal entries painted a picture of Sarah as a woman who'd maintained extensive community connections, while Boone had gradually narrowed his focus to ranch operations and their immediate family life. She'd been a bridge between his isolation and the broader world, maintaining relationships and providing support in ways that had gone completely unnoticed by her husband. Blue wandered into the study and settled at Boone's feet, sensing his emotional state with canine intuition. The dog's presence provided comfort, but it also emphasized the irony of the situation. An animal had succeeded in drawing Boone back into community engagement where years of human attempts had failed. The next morning brought an early phone call from Dr. Martinez with unexpected news. Boone, I was at the hospital yesterday checking on another patient, and I stopped by to see Miss Lorna. She's making remarkable progress, better than anyone expected for someone in her condition. That's good news. Yes, but there's a complication. The hospital's discharge planner needs to know where she'll be going when she's released. That cabin isn't habitable in its current condition, and she doesn't seem to have any other options. The practical problem that Boone had been avoiding couldn't be postponed indefinitely. Miss Lorna needed somewhere to live that wouldn't endanger her health, but her financial limitations severely restricted her choices. The proud woman who'd once commanded respect as the community's premier music teacher now faced the possibility of institutional care simply because she lacked alternatives. How long before she's discharged? Boone asked. End of the week, possibly sooner. She's responding well to treatment, and hospitals don't keep people longer than medically necessary. After hanging up, Boone found himself standing in Sarah's abandoned garden, now overgrown with weeds and volunteer plants that had survived 3 seasons of neglect. Sarah's gardening journal had revealed her belief that caring for others was as natural and necessary as caring for growing things. Both required attention, patience, and faith in outcomes that couldn't be guaranteed. The decision formed gradually, emerging from a combination of practical necessity and emotional recognition that surprised him with its clarity. Miss Lorna needed help, and he had the resources to provide it. More importantly, helping her felt like honoring Sarah's memory in a way that simply maintaining her physical possessions could never achieve. Pete found him that afternoon making measurements and notes around the ranch house's guest quarters, ATT2, small apartment that had been built for Sarah's mother but had remained unused since her death 5 years earlier. The space included a bedroom, bathroom, and small sitting area that opened onto the main house's kitchen, providing independence while maintaining connection. Planning some renovations? Pete asked, studying Boone's careful notations. Maybe. The guest room needs some work. New plumbing fixtures. Fresh paint, better insulation. Boone paused, then continued with the kind of personal disclosure that had become foreign to him. I'm thinking about offering it to Miss Lorna temporarily, until she can figure out a more permanent solution. Pete nodded slowly, unsurprised by the development. Sarah would have liked that, he said simply. The comment hit home with unexpected force. Sarah would indeed have approved, not just of the practical help, but of Boone's willingness to open his carefully guarded space to someone in need. The garden journal had revealed that she'd been quietly providing similar support for years, understanding community responsibility as a natural extension of personal values. That evening, Boone sat on his porch, reading more of Sarah's journal entries by lamplight. Blue curled beside his chair like a living reminder of the power of unwavering loyalty. The entries revealed a woman who'd understood that isolation was a luxury that community life couldn't afford. That individual well-being was ultimately connected to collective health as he planned the renovations that would make the guest quarters suitable for Miss Lorna's occupancy. Boone realized that caring about her welfare didn't diminish his love for Sarah. It honored it. The guilt he'd expected to feel about forming new emotional connections was being replaced by something that felt more like purpose, as if Sarah's memory was calling him back to engagement rather than pushing him toward continued withdrawal. Miss Lorna's insistence on returning to the cabin caught everyone off guard. Despite Boone's careful preparations of the guest quarters and Dr. Martinez's strong medical advice against it, she maintained with quiet determination that her independence couldn't be compromised, even temporarily. "I appreciate your generous offer more than you know," she told Boone during what turned out to be their final hospital conversation. "But I won't become a burden to anyone, not even someone as kind as you've become." The word "become" struck Boone as significant. Miss Lorna was acknowledging that he'd changed during the week of hospital visits, that the man who'd found her collapsed was different from the one preparing to take her home. The transformation felt gradual to him, but apparently it was visible to others. Blue's excitement at returning to familiar territory was evident during the drive back to the valley. The dog pressed his nose to the truck window, his tail wagging as they approached the cabin that had been his home during Miss Lorna's months of isolation. But when they arrived, even Blue seemed subdued by the building's deteriorated condition. A week of additional rain had worsened the existing problems. Water damage from the leaking roof had spread to areas that had been merely damp before, and several floorboards near the piano had begun to warp from moisture exposure. The cabin that had seemed merely neglected now appeared genuinely uninhabitable. Miss Lorna surveyed the damage with visible dismay, but maintained her composure. "It looks worse than it is," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "A little clean-up, some strategic bucket placement. It'll be fine." Boone examined the roof damage from inside, noting places where daylight was visible through gaps in the shingles. The repairs needed weren't cosmetic, they were structural, requiring materials and labor that would cost far more than Miss Lorna's limited resources could support. It was while helping her salvage water-damaged belongings that Boone discovered the true extent of her piano's deterioration. Several keys stuck completely, refusing to respond to pressure, while others produced sounds that bore no resemblance to their intended notes. The instrument that had once been the center of Miss Lorna's professional life was now barely functional, its voice distorted by moisture and neglect. Miss Lorna touched the damaged keys with obvious grief, her fingers tracing patterns of scales she could no longer properly play. "Harold bought this piano for our first wedding anniversary," she said quietly. "It wasn't expensive, we couldn't afford expensive, but it had such a sweet tone. I've taught hundreds of students on these keys." She pressed middle C, producing a sound that was more thud than note. The key stuck in the depressed position, a small mechanical failure that somehow represented the larger tragedy of dreams, deferred by circumstances beyond one's control. "It can probably be repaired," Boone offered, though he suspected the damage was too extensive for anything but complete restoration. "With what money?" Miss Lorna's question was gentle but pointed. "Piano repair isn't cheap, and I'm barely managing to keep food on the table and gas in the car." The admission of financial desperation came reluctantly, forced by circumstances that made pretense impossible. Miss Lorna had been living on Social Security payments that barely covered basic necessities, supplemented by occasional piano lessons for children whose parents could afford to pay. But the students had dwindled as her isolation increased, creating a cycle where reduced visibility meant reduced income. Over the following days, Boone found himself making daily trips to the cabin, ostensibly to check on Miss Lorna's welfare, but actually to assess problems that seemed to multiply with each visit. The roof leaked in at least 6 places. The porch steps were rotting and dangerous. The electrical system was so outdated it posed a fire hazard. Blue's presence provided emotional support, but the dog couldn't fix what was fundamentally wrong with the building. Pete noticed the pattern during their morning ranch work. "You're spending a lot of time at that cabin," he observed. "Not critically, but with obvious concern. She needs help. And there's no one else. That's true. But you need to decide how much help you're prepared to provide. From where I'm sitting, it looks like she needs a complete renovation or a different place to live." The conversation forced Boone to confront questions he'd been avoiding. How much responsibility was he prepared to accept for Miss Lorna's welfare? Where did neighborly assistance end and personal obligation begin? The line between temporary help and long-term commitment was blurring in ways that made him uncomfortable. Dr. Martinez raised similar concerns when he encountered Boone at the hardware store. "Loading supplies for another cabin repair project. I'm glad you're helping her," the doctor said. "But I'm worried about Miss Lorna's long-term prospects in that building. It's not suitable for someone recovering from pneumonia, especially with winter coming. Have you considered other options?" "She won't accept other options. She's determined to maintain her independence. Sometimes independence becomes a luxury people can't afford. I've seen proud people die from preventable causes because they couldn't accept help when they needed it most." That evening, Boone sat on Miss Lorna's sagging porch, drinking coffee and watching Blue patrol the cabin's perimeter with obvious concern. The dog's behavior had changed since their return. He seemed more vigilant, more protective, as if sensing that his human remained vulnerable despite her recovery from the immediate medical crisis. Miss Lorna emerged from the cabin wearing a sweater despite the warm evening, her recent illness having left her sensitive to temperature changes. She settled carefully into the chair beside Boone, her movements still showing the after-effects of her collapse. "You've been very patient with me," she said, "but I can see the worry in your face. You're wondering what happens when winter comes, whether this old building can keep me safe through another Montana cold season." Her directness surprised him. "The cabin needs extensive repairs. The cabin needs to be torn down and rebuilt, which we both know isn't going to happen." Miss Lorna's voice held the calm acceptance of someone who'd faced difficult truths without flinching. "I'm an elderly woman with limited resources and no family support. My options are genuinely constrained." The quiet acknowledgement of her situation hung between them like a challenge. Boone had been dancing around the central question for days. Was he prepared to make Miss Lorna's welfare his permanent responsibility, or was he simply prolonging an ultimately unsolvable problem? Blue wandered over and settled at Miss Lorna's feet, his presence a reminder that some commitments were made without calculation or hesitation. The dog had accepted responsibility for her protection without considering cost or convenience, demonstrating a loyalty that put human caution to shame. "There's something I should probably tell you," Miss Lorna continued, her voice becoming more hesitant. "The cabin, it's not actually secure. I mean, I own it now that Martha's gone, but there are complications with the property taxes. I've been trying to handle it myself, but the situation is becoming challenging." The admission suggested problems that extended beyond immediate habitability issues. Property tax complications could mean liens, potential foreclosure, legal difficulties that required expertise and resources Miss Lorna clearly lacked. As if summoned by their conversation, a car appeared on the muddy road leading to the cabin, an expensive sedan that looked out of place in the rural setting. The driver parked near Boone's truck and emerged wearing the kind of suit that suggested official business. Blue immediately positioned himself between the stranger and Miss Lorna, his alert posture indicating that this visitor represented some form of threat. Miss Lorna's face went pale as she recognized the man approaching their porch. "Miss Weatherby," the visitor called out, his tone professionally cordial but somehow ominous. "We need to talk." The man in the expensive suit introduced himself as Robert Henley, representing Dakota Development Corporation. His presence on Miss Lorna's porch felt predatory, like a hawk circling over vulnerable prey. Blue's protective instincts kicked into high gear. the dog positioning himself between the developer and Miss Lorna with obvious suspicion. "Miss Weatherby, I believe you received our certified letters regarding the tax lien situation," Henley said, producing a leather portfolio filled with official-looking documents. "We're prepared to finalize our previous offer, which would resolve your financial difficulties and provide you with relocation funds." Miss Lorna's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the paperwork, though whether from illness or fear, Boone couldn't determine. "I told you before, Mr. Henley, I'm not interested in selling. This property belonged to my sister, and now it belongs to me. Actually, Miss Weatherby, that's where the situation has become complicated." Henley's voice carried the practiced sympathy of someone delivering bad news professionally. "The county tax assessor's office has confirmed that property taxes haven't been paid in 18 months. The total amount owed, including penalties and interest, now exceeds $8,000. The number hit Miss Lorna like a physical blow. Boone watched color drain from her face as she processed the implications of debt that represented more money than she could accumulate in years of careful living. "There must be some mistake," she whispered. "Martha always paid her taxes. She was meticulous about such things. Your sister fell behind during her final illness," Henley explained with practiced gentleness that didn't quite conceal his eagerness. "Medical expenses, you understand. It happens more often than people realize. The county has begun foreclosure proceedings, but Dakota Development is prepared to purchase the tax lien and take ownership of the property. We're offering you $5,000 for a quick sale, enough to relocate and establish yourself somewhere more suitable for your needs." Boone studied the documents over Miss Lorna's shoulder, his anger building as he processed the legal language. The papers revealed a coordinated effort to acquire her property at a fraction of its actual value, taking advantage of an elderly woman's financial vulnerability and social isolation. "What does Dakota Development want with this particular piece of land?" Boone asked, his voice carrying an edge that made Henley look at him with new attention. "The property sits on what will become a major access road for our planned resort development in the Upper Valley. The location is essential to our transportation infrastructure." The revelation put Miss Lorna's situation into stark perspective. She wasn't just facing random financial difficulties. She was an obstacle to a development project that had been planned around her removal. Her isolation hadn't gone unnoticed. It had been counted on. "How long has Dakota Development been planning this resort?" Boone pressed. "The project has been in development for several years. We've been quietly acquiring properties throughout the valley, and Miss Weatherby's parcel is one of the final pieces we need." Miss Lorna looked up from the legal documents with dawning understanding. "You've been waiting for me to fail, haven't you? Waiting for the taxes to become insurmountable so you could take the property cheaply." Henley's professional mask slipped slightly. "We're offering fair market value, considering the property's current condition and your financial circumstances. The alternative is foreclosure and losing everything with no compensation whatsoever." Blue growled low in his throat, responding to the tension crackling between the adults. The dog's loyalty was absolute, but Boone could see intelligence in the animal's eyes that suggested Blue understood more about human nature than many people credited. "I need time to think," Miss Lorna said finally. "Unfortunately, time is limited. The foreclosure process moves quickly once it begins, and our offer has an expiration date. You have until Friday to decide, 4 days from now." After Henley departed, leaving behind the legal documents like contaminated evidence, Miss Lorna sat in stunned silence on her porch. The reality of her situation had crystallized into an impossible choice: accept an inadequate buyout from developers or lose everything through foreclosure. "I should have known," she said quietly. "Martha mentioned having trouble with bills during her last months, but I thought she'd managed to keep the taxes current. She was always so proud of maintaining her obligations." Boone examined the legal papers more carefully, noting dates and details that painted a picture of systematic exploitation. Dakota Development had been monitoring the property situation for months, waiting for the perfect moment to make their move. "There has to be something we can do," he said. "Legal options, appeals, something. With what resources? I don't have $8,000, and I certainly can't afford attorneys to fight a development corporation. They've planned this carefully, Boone. They know exactly how helpless I am." That night, Boone returned to Sarah's journal with new urgency, searching for any mention of Miss Lorna's property situation or financial struggles. What he found in entries from Sarah's final months shocked him with their prescience. "Visited Lorna again today. She's more worried than she admits about Martha's situation. Medical bills are overwhelming, and Lorna suspects the property taxes have fallen behind. I offered to help, but Lorna's pride makes accepting assistance almost impossible. I've been setting aside money each month. If the situation becomes critical, I want to be able to step in. Boone doesn't need to know about this now. He has enough to worry about with my treatment schedule." The entry was dated 3 months before Sarah's death. Boone turned pages frantically, finding more references to a fund Sarah had been building specifically to help Miss Lorna. Spoke with Jim Hartley at the bank about setting up a separate account. "If something happens to me before Lorna's situation is resolved, I want to make sure she's protected." Jim suggested a provision in my will that would handle the transfer without creating tax complications for her. "I pray Boone will understand why I kept this private. Some acts of charity work best in silence." Boone's hands shook as he read the entry. Sarah had been planning to help Miss Lorna financially, but her own death had intervened before the plan could be implemented. The question was whether her will actually included the provision she discussed with the banker. Early the next morning, Boone drove to town and found Jim Hartley opening the bank. The elderly banker had served the community for 40 years and had handled both Sarah's and Boone's financial affairs with discretion and competence. "Jim, I need to ask you about something Sarah discussed with you before she died." "Something about a fund for Miss Lorna Weatherby." Jim's face brightened with recognition. "I wondered when you'd discover that. Sarah was very specific about maintaining confidentiality until the time was right. She set aside $10,000 from her life insurance policy, with instructions that it be made available to Miss Lorna if she faced financial crisis related to property taxes or housing costs." The revelation hit Boone like a thunderbolt. Sarah had anticipated Miss Lorna's current crisis and made provisions to address it, but had died before explaining her intentions to her husband. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" Sarah's instructions were explicit. The fund was to remain secret unless and until Miss Lorna faced genuine crisis. She didn't want charity to become a source of embarrassment or obligation. When I heard about Miss Lorna's recent medical emergency and current housing situation, I began wondering if the time had come to reveal Sarah's provision. Back at the cabin, Boone found Miss Lorna sitting at her damaged piano, pressing the broken keys with obvious sadness. Blue lay beside the piano bench, his presence offering comfort that words couldn't provide. "Miss Lorna," Boone said, his voice careful and gentle, "I have something to tell you about Sarah, about provisions she made before she died." As he explained Sarah's secret fund and its intended purpose, tears began streaming down Miss Lorna's weathered face. The $10,000 would more than cover the back taxes and provide resources for essential cabin repairs. "She never said a word to me about this," Miss Lorna whispered. "All those visits, all those conversations about music and gardening and life, she never hinted that she was planning such generosity. That was Sarah's way. She believed the best charity was invisible to everyone except the person who needed it." Blue wandered over to Boone and sat at his feet, tail wagging slowly as if sensing that the crisis threatening his human security was finally being addressed. The dog's loyalty had led to Miss Lorna's rescue, but Sarah's foresight had provided the means for her salvation. "But why?" Miss Lorna asked. "Why would Sarah do this for me?" Boone thought of the journal entries, of Sarah's belief that community members were responsible for each other's welfare, because she understood that we're all connected, that helping you was part of what made her life meaningful. She saw the crisis coming and prepared for it the only way she knew how. The legal documents from Dakota Development still lay on Miss Lorna's kitchen table, but they no longer represented an insurmountable threat. Sarah's gift had transformed a desperate situation into a manageable problem, proving that love could transcend death through careful preparation and genuine understanding of what mattered most. The discovery of Sarah's secret fund provided immediate relief from the tax crisis, but it also opened questions about the depth of her relationship with Miss Lorna that Boone had never understood. That evening, he returned to Sarah's study with new determination, searching not just her journal, but every drawer and file for evidence of the friendship that had apparently flourished beneath his notice. In a small cedar box he'd never examined, assuming it contained only Sarah's personal mementos, he found a collection of letters that made him question how well he'd known his own wife. The correspondence between Sarah and Miss Lorna spanned nearly 15 years, beginning shortly after their marriage and continuing almost until Sarah's death. The earliest letters were formal, written on Sarah's monogrammed stationery with the careful politeness of new community relationships. But as Boone read chronologically, he watched the friendship deepen into something approaching sisterhood. Sarah's side of the correspondence revealed loneliness he'd never recognized, a need for feminine companionship that his devoted but fundamentally masculine presence couldn't fulfill. "Dear Lorna," one letter began, "I hope you don't mind my writing to you directly, but I find myself thinking often about our conversation after church last Sunday. You mentioned feeling invisible since Harold's death, as if the town sees you only as half of what you used to be. I understand that feeling more than you might imagine. Sometimes I feel like Boone's wife rather than Sarah, as if my identity exists only in relation to his. Perhaps this is why I'm drawn to your garden philosophy, that every plant has its own essential nature, regardless of what grows beside it." The letters revealed Sarah as more intellectually complex and emotionally nuanced than Boone had fully appreciated. Her correspondence with Miss Lorna explored topics ranging from literature to philosophy, from community politics to personal struggles with the isolation that ranch life sometimes imposed. Miss Lorna's responses, carefully preserved in Sarah's neat filing system, showed equal depth and growing affection. Her letters painted pictures of a woman whose artistic sensibilities and educational background had prepared her for a wider world than small-town Montana provided, but who had found contentment in nurturing young musical talent and maintaining the cultural traditions that kept communities connected to beauty. Blue wandered into the study and settled beside Boone's chair, the dog's presence somehow appropriate to the process of discovering hidden relationships. The animal represented loyalty uncomplicated by deception, commitment that didn't require explanation or justification. One letter, dated 2 years before Sarah's cancer diagnosis, revealed the practical beginnings of her financial planning for Miss Lorna. "I've been thinking about Harold's medical expenses and how they've affected your situation. Please don't be offended by my directness, but I know what extended illness costs, and I suspect you're facing financial pressures that pride prevents you from discussing. Boone and I have been fortunate in our ranch income, and I've begun setting aside funds that might help if your circumstances become difficult. This isn't charity, it's friendship, and friendship means being prepared to help when help is needed." Miss Lorna's response to that letter showed the delicate dance of accepting assistance without compromising dignity. "Your generosity overwhelms me, though I pray it never becomes necessary to accept it. But knowing that someone cares enough to plan for my potential difficulties provides comfort I can't adequately express. You understand how hard it is for people like me to ask for help. We were raised to believe that independence was a virtue and dependence a failing. But perhaps true independence means having friends who love you enough to anticipate your needs." The correspondence continued through Sarah's illness, with Miss Lorna offering emotional support that complemented the medical care Sarah received. Her letters during that period were filled with encouragement, shared memories, and gentle reminders that life's meaning often emerged from connections that transcended individual mortality. Sarah, darling, one letter read, I know you're frightened about what happens to Boone after you're gone. He's built his entire emotional life around you, and you worry that your death will leave him isolated and disconnected. But love doesn't end with death. It transforms into something that continues to influence the world through the people who were touched by it. Boone carries your compassion inside him, even if he doesn't recognize it yet. When the time comes, he'll find ways to honor your memory through service to others. Trust in that. The prophecy felt eerily accurate as Boone read it, recognizing his current situation as the fulfillment of Miss Lorna's prediction. His care for her wasn't separate from his love for Sarah. It was an expression of values Sarah had instilled through their marriage. The most significant letter was dated just 6 weeks before Sarah's death, when her condition had deteriorated to the point where writing required considerable effort. Lorna, if you're reading this, it means the provisions I've made are being activated. By now you know about the financial fund, but there's something else I want you to understand. Boone doesn't know about our friendship, not because I wanted to deceive him, but because I needed something that was entirely my own. Our correspondence, our shared love of music and literature, our discussions about the meaning of community, these sustained me in ways that even my wonderful marriage couldn't provide. I've watched Boone withdraw from community engagement over the years, not from lack of caring, but from fear of vulnerability. My illness will make that withdrawal more extreme, and I worry that he'll build walls so high that love can't reach him. You were his teacher once, Lorna. You understood his potential for deep feeling, even when he couldn't express it. If circumstances bring you back into his life, please help him remember that caring for others is what makes life meaningful. He needs to learn that loving one person deeply doesn't mean shutting out everyone else. The letter continued with specific instructions about the financial arrangements Sarah had made, but it concluded with a request that struck Boone as both wise and heartbreaking. Don't tell him about our letters unless he discovers them himself. Let him think his decision to help you is entirely his own. It will mean more that way, and it will represent genuine growth rather than obligation to my memory. But know that if he chooses to care for you, he's honoring everything I tried to teach him about the connection between love and service. Boone set the letters aside with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the complexity of Sarah's love and the extent of her planning for his emotional recovery. She'd understood him better than he understood himself, anticipating his reactions and preparing circumstances that would draw him back toward human connection. The next morning brought renewed urgency about Miss Lorna's legal situation. While Sarah's fund would cover the back taxes, it wouldn't protect the property from future development pressure, unless the community rallied to support her right to remain. Dakota Development wouldn't simply disappear because their first attempt had been thwarted. They would find other ways to acquire the land they needed. Boone made a decision that 3 years ago would have been unthinkable. He drove to town and began talking to people about Miss Lorna's situation. His first stop was Dr. Martinez's clinic, where he explained the development company's tactics and the threat they posed to an elderly community member. I remember Miss Lorna well, Dr. Martinez said. She taught piano lessons to both of my daughters when they were young. A wonderful patient teacher who made music accessible to children who might never have discovered their talents otherwise. Would you be willing to support her publicly? Maybe sign a petition or speak at a county hearing if it comes to that? Dr. Martinez didn't hesitate. Absolutely. And I know others who would feel the same way. Former students, parents whose children benefited from her teaching, community members who believe in protecting longtime residents from predatory development. The conversation pattern repeated itself throughout the day as Boone visited businesses and homes throughout the valley. His first public advocacy in 3 years felt awkward and exhausting, but the response was overwhelmingly positive. Miss Lorna had touched more lives than he'd realized, and her potential displacement angered people who might otherwise have remained uninvolved. Pete found him that evening making lists of potential supporters and preparing for what was beginning to look like a community organizing campaign. "I haven't seen you this engaged in anything since Sarah died," Pete observed. "It's good to see you caring about something again." "Sarah would have done this already," Boone replied. "She would have organized the entire valley to protect Miss Lorna without thinking twice about it." "Maybe, but Sarah's not here and you are. Sometimes that's how things work. We step into roles we never expected to fill because circumstances demand it." Blue appeared at Boone's feet, the dog's presence a constant reminder of loyalty that didn't require justification or explanation. As Boone prepared for what might become a legal battle with well-funded developers, he drew strength from both the dog's simple devotion and Sarah's complex planning for exactly this kind of crisis. The letters had revealed that his current actions weren't coincidental. They were the natural result of values Sarah had spent years nurturing, coming to fruition in circumstances she'd anticipated with remarkable accuracy. Miss Lorna needed protection, and Boone had both the resources and the motivation to provide it. But success would require more than individual effort. It would demand the kind of community mobilization that Sarah had excelled at and that Boone was only beginning to understand. The next few days would determine whether Miss Lorna's decades of service to the community had created bonds strong enough to protect her from forces that valued profit over human dignity. The county courthouse hadn't seen such a crowd for a property hearing in anyone's memory. Word of Miss Lorna's situation had spread through the valley's informal communication networks with surprising speed, and the community response exceeded even Boone's optimistic expectations. Cars and pickup trucks filled the parking lot and lined the streets for several blocks, bringing together ranchers, shopkeepers, retirees, and young families united by shared concern for their former piano teacher. Miss Lorna sat in the front row between Boone and Dr. Martinez, her hands folded carefully in her lap, despite the obvious nervousness she felt at being the center of such attention. She wore her best dress, a navy blue piece that had seen better days, but was pressed and clean, and her silver hair was arranged with the same careful precision she'd maintained throughout her teaching years. Blue waited in Boone's truck outside, his presence a source of comfort even from a distance. The dog had developed an uncanny ability to sense Miss Lorna's emotional state, and his calm demeanor that morning had helped reassure everyone that the day's proceedings would somehow work out favorably. Robert Henley from Dakota Development sat across the aisle with 2 attorneys and a briefcase full of legal documents, their expensive suits and confident manner suggesting they viewed the hearing as a formality before completing their property acquisition. They'd clearly expected to face an isolated elderly woman with no resources and no support, not a community mobilized in defense of one of its own. The petition that Pete had helped circulate lay on the table before County Commissioner Margaret Walsh, its pages covered with signatures that represented a cross-section of the valley's population. 67 names in total, from teenagers who'd never taken piano lessons to elderly ranchers who remembered Miss Lorna from her early teaching days. Each signature represented someone who'd been touched by her presence in the community and was willing to stand publicly in support of her right to remain. Commissioner Walsh called the hearing to order with the grave formality that property disputes demanded. "We're here today to review the tax lien situation on the Weatherby property and to hear from all interested parties regarding its resolution." Dakota Development's lead attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Patricia Moss, presented their case with practiced efficiency. She outlined Miss Lorna's tax delinquency, the company's legal right to acquire the property through lien purchase, and the development project's potential economic benefits for the county. The proposed resort development will create hundreds of jobs and generate significant tax revenue, Moss argued. Miss Weatherby's inability to maintain her tax obligations demonstrates that the property is better suited to more productive use. Our client's offer of $5,000 represents fair compensation, considering the property's current condition and market constraints. When asked to respond, Miss Lorna rose slowly, her voice initially tremulous but gaining strength as she spoke. "Commissioners, I don't dispute that I fell behind on tax payments during a difficult period, but those taxes have now been paid in full, along with all penalties and interest. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the same consideration that would be extended to any property owner who resolved their tax obligations." Commissioner Walsh confirmed that the tax payment had indeed been received and that the county's lien had been satisfied. This development clearly caught Dakota Development's attorneys off guard, and they requested a brief recess to confer among themselves. During the break, Dr. Martinez addressed the commissioners as the first community witness. "Miss Lorna Weatherby taught piano to my daughters and to hundreds of other children over her 25 years in this community. She never turned away a student because of inability to pay, and she maintained the highest standards of musical education while making lessons accessible to families of all economic backgrounds." The testimony continued with former students, parents and community members sharing stories of Miss Lorna's influence. Maria Santos, now a high school music teacher herself, credited Miss Lorna with inspiring her career choice. "She taught me that music wasn't just about technical skill. It was about expressing something true and beautiful. That lesson has shaped not just my teaching, but my entire approach to life." Tom Bradley, whose son had struggled with learning disabilities, described how Miss Lorna's patient instruction had given the boy confidence that extended far beyond music. She saw potential in Jimmy that no one else recognized, and she nurtured it until he could see it himself. That's what teachers do. They help us become who we're meant to be. As the testimonials accumulated, it became clear that Miss Lorna represented more than just an individual property owner. She embodied the community's commitment to education, cultural enrichment, and the belief that some contributions to society couldn't be measured in purely economic terms. Boone had prepared remarks but found himself departing from his written notes as he stood before the commissioners. "3 weeks ago, I was a man who'd withdrawn from community life, convinced that isolation was safer than caring about other people's welfare. Miss Lorna didn't ask me to get involved in her problems. Circumstances forced us together, and I discovered that helping someone else gave my own life meaning it had been lacking." He paused, looking directly at the Dakota Development representatives. "Companies like Dakota Development count on our indifference. They assume we won't notice when elderly community members are targeted for exploitation, or that we won't care enough to intervene. This hearing proves they were wrong about this community." Commissioner Walsh examined the petition carefully, noting names she recognized from years of county service. The document represented more than signatures. It was evidence of social bonds that development companies couldn't quantify but couldn't afford to ignore. Patricia Moss made a final argument, emphasizing the legal rights of property developers and the economic benefits of the proposed resort. But her words felt hollow against the weight of community testimony, and even she seemed to recognize that the hearing had shifted from a legal formality to a referendum on community values. As the formal presentations concluded, Miss Lorna requested permission to make a final statement. She rose with dignity that belied her recent medical crisis and spoke with the clear voice that had guided countless students through difficult musical passages. "I moved back to this valley not because I had nowhere else to go, but because this is home. Home isn't just a building. It's a place where people know your story and value your contributions. Today, you've shown me that my story matters to this community, and I'm grateful beyond words for your support." The commissioners retired to deliberate, while the packed courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation. Blue's distant barking could be heard through the courthouse windows. the dog somehow sensing the tension inside, despite being unable to see the proceedings. When Commissioner Walsh returned with her decision, the room fell silent in anticipation of words that would determine whether Miss Lorna's fight for independence had succeeded or whether the forces of development would prevail through superior resources and legal maneuvering. Commissioner Walsh's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected people's lives. After reviewing all testimony and examining the legal documentation, this commission finds that Miss Weatherby's tax obligations have been satisfied in full, and that her property ownership rights remain intact. A collective sigh of relief swept through the courthouse, but Commissioner Walsh raised her hand for continued attention. However, Dakota Development has raised legitimate questions about the source of funds used to satisfy the tax lien. Before this matter can be considered fully resolved, we need documentation showing that the payment was made with legally obtained resources. The unexpected requirement sent a chill through the courtroom. Patricia Moss smiled with obvious satisfaction, recognizing an opportunity to challenge the tax payment on technical grounds. If the source of Miss Lorna's sudden financial resources couldn't be properly documented, her victory might be temporary. The payment was made from a fund specifically established for this purpose, Boone said, rising from his seat. I can provide the necessary documentation. He produced a manila folder that Jim Hartley had prepared that morning, containing the legal instruments that formalized Sarah's planning for Miss Lorna's crisis. The documents were more complex than Boone had initially understood, revealing the extent of Sarah's foresight and her determination to protect her friend even after death. These are the papers establishing the Lorna Weatherby Assistance Fund, Boone announced, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. The fund was created by my late wife, Sarah Cavanaugh, using proceeds from her life insurance policy. The payment was made according to provisions she established before her death 3 years ago. The revelation sent murmurs through the assembled crowd. Most people had known Sarah as Boone's wife and a community gardening enthusiast, but few had suspected the depth of her relationship with Miss Lorna or the extent of her charitable planning. Jim Hartley, who had closed his bank to attend the hearing, rose to provide additional context. Mrs. Cavanaugh came to me 2 years before her death with specific instructions about creating a fund to assist Miss Lorna in case of financial emergency. She worked with our legal department to ensure the arrangement would protect Miss Lorna's dignity while providing necessary resources. Commissioner Walsh examined the life insurance documents with careful attention. The paperwork showed that Sarah had designated $10,000 from her policy specifically for Miss Lorna's use, with detailed instructions about when and how the funds should be released. The legal language was precise and thorough, reflecting planning that had anticipated exactly the current situation. The beneficiary designation is clear, Commissioner Walsh announced after reviewing the documents. Mrs. Cavanaugh legally allocated these funds for Miss Weatherby's assistance with property-related expenses. The tax payment was made with legitimately designated resources. Patricia Moss examined the documents with obvious frustration, searching for technical flaws that might invalidate the arrangement. But Sarah's planning had been meticulous, guided by professional legal advice, and executed with the kind of precision that anticipated potential challenges. Miss Lorna had been listening to the proceedings with growing amazement, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she processed the full extent of Sarah's love and foresight. The woman she'd considered a dear friend had been more than generous. She'd been prophetic, anticipating needs and obstacles with uncanny accuracy. "There's something else," Jim Hartley continued, producing another document from his briefcase. Mrs. Cavanaugh's instructions included provisions for ongoing support if Miss Lorna faced continued financial difficulties. The fund contains additional resources beyond what was needed for the tax payment. The announcement silenced even Dakota Development's legal team. Sarah hadn't just provided emergency assistance, she'd created a safety net that could protect Miss Lorna from future exploitation attempts. Blue's distant barking grew more excited, the dog somehow sensing that the crisis was resolving favorably for his human. His loyalty had been the catalyst that brought Boone and Miss Lorna together. But Sarah's planning had provided the resources that made their connection sustainable. Commissioner Walsh rendered her final decision with formal gravity. The Commission finds that Miss Weatherby's property ownership is legally secure, that her tax obligations have been properly satisfied, and that Dakota Development's lien purchase offer is no longer relevant. The property remains in Miss Weatherby's ownership without encumbrance. The courthouse erupted in applause and cheers, the community celebrating a victory that represented more than one person's housing security. They had successfully defended the principle that long-time residents deserved protection from predatory development, that community bonds could overcome corporate pressure. Miss Lorna rose unsteadily, overwhelmed by emotion and the magnitude of support she'd received. Dr. Martinez steadied her as she acknowledged the crowd's celebration with a wave that conveyed gratitude beyond words. Robert Henley and his legal team gathered their materials with obvious displeasure, their carefully planned property acquisition derailed by circumstances they hadn't anticipated. As they left the courthouse, their expensive suits and briefcases looked somehow diminished against the backdrop of community solidarity. Sarah knew, Miss Lorna whispered to Boone as the crowd began to disperse. She understood exactly what would happen and prepared for it with such precision. How could she have known? Boone thought of Sarah's letters, her understanding of human nature and community dynamics, her belief that love expressed through service could transcend individual mortality. She knew because she loved you enough to imagine your future needs. And she knew me well enough to predict how I'd respond when those needs became apparent. The life insurance documents represented more than financial planning. They were evidence of friendship that had prepared for its own continuation through changed circumstances. Sarah had created a bridge between her life and her death, ensuring that her love for both Miss Lorna and Boone would continue to influence their lives long after her physical presence ended. As they left the courthouse together, Blue's joyful barking welcomed them back to a world where security had been restored and community had proven stronger than exploitation. The dog's tail wagged with the simple satisfaction of a job well done, his loyalty having been the first link in a chain of events that had saved both Miss Lorna's home and Boone's heart. 6 months later, the sound of piano music drifted across the valley on warm spring air, carrying melodies that had been absent from the community for far too long. Miss Lorna's cabin had been transformed through careful renovation work that preserved its character while making it genuinely habitable. The new roof no longer leaked, the porch had been rebuilt with proper supports, and the electrical system met current safety standards. But it was the piano that represented the most significant change. The old instrument, damaged beyond repair by months of moisture and neglect, had been replaced by a beautifully restored upright that Boone had found through a music dealer in Billings. The piano's rich tone filled the cabin with warmth and possibility, its keys responding to Miss Lorna's touch with the clarity and expression that proper instruments could provide. The afternoon lesson in progress featured 8-year-old Emma Martinez, Dr. Martinez's youngest daughter, whose small fingers were learning to navigate the intricacies of a simple Bach minuet. Miss Lorna's teaching style hadn't changed. She remained patient and encouraging, finding ways to make challenging concepts accessible to young minds eager to create beautiful sounds. Remember, Emma, music is like conversation, Miss Lorna said, guiding the child's hands to the proper position. Each note has something to say, and your job is to help them speak clearly. Through the cabin's new windows, Boone could be seen working in the garden he'd helped Miss Lorna establish adjacent to her home. The plot was modest but productive, containing the kinds of vegetables and herbs that had filled Sarah's garden journals with enthusiastic observations. Miss Lorna had requested his assistance with the physical labor of gardening, but she'd surprised him by contributing knowledge about companion planting and soil management that rivaled Sarah's expertise. Blue supervised the garden work from his favorite spot in the shade, the dog having appointed himself as overseer of all activities that involved his humans. His coat had regained the glossy health that proper nutrition and veterinary care provided, and his demeanor reflected the contentment of an animal whose protective duties had been successful. The lesson concluded with Emma playing her piece from beginning to end without mistakes, her face glowing with the satisfaction that musical accomplishment provided. Miss Lorna had maintained her tradition of awarding star stickers for successful performances, and Emma carefully placed her new decoration on the practice chart that tracked her weekly progress. "Will you teach me the harder piece next week?" Emma asked, already anticipating greater challenges. "We'll see how your practice goes," Miss Lorna replied with the gentle authority that had guided hundreds of students through similar stages of development. Music rewards preparation, and preparation requires patience. After Emma departed with promises to practice diligently, Miss Lorna and Boone settled on the cabin's new porch to share afternoon coffee, a ritual that had developed naturally over the months of their renewed friendship. The porch provided a perfect vantage point for watching the valley's seasonal changes and observing the wildlife that thrived in the area's protected spaces. 14 new students since January, Miss Lorna reported with obvious satisfaction. Word has spread that piano lessons are available again, and parents are eager to provide their children with musical education. "Sarah would be pleased," Boone said, a comment that no longer carried the weight of grief it once had. His wife's memory had evolved from a source of pain into something that inspired continued growth and service. "I think about her often during lessons," Miss Lorna replied. Her letters mentioned how much she valued the cultural opportunities that music education provided. She understood that communities need beauty and art to remain fully human. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching on the improved road that now connected the cabin to the main thoroughfare. Pete emerged from Boone's truck, followed by Rex, who immediately engaged Blue in the kind of playful wrestling that had become their standard greeting. "How's the fence repair project coming along?" Pete asked, settling into the third porch chair that had been added to accommodate regular visitors. "Almost finished," Boone replied. "The new posts are set, and we should have the wire strung by the end of the week." The fence project represented more than property maintenance. It symbolized Miss Lorna's permanent integration into the valley's social and economic networks. Her teaching income, combined with Sarah's continuing provisions, had enabled her to make improvements that demonstrated long-term commitment to remaining in the community. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, Miss Lorna returned to the piano for her own practice session. The music she chose, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, filled the cabin with sophisticated beauty that spoke to emotions too complex for ordinary language. Boone listened from the porch, remembering his teenage years when similar melodies had seemed impossibly beyond his understanding. Now he recognized the Nocturne's combination of technical precision and emotional depth as a perfect reflection of Miss Lorna herself, someone who had maintained artistic standards while adapting to circumstances that might have defeated less resilient spirits. Blue wandered inside and positioned himself beside the piano bench, his presence a reminder of the loyalty that had made all subsequent developments possible. The dog's intervention on that stormy morning had connected two people who needed each other without knowing it, creating a partnership that honored the past while embracing the future. As darkness approached, Boone prepared to return to his ranch for evening chores. But his departure no longer felt like retreat into isolation. Tomorrow would bring another afternoon visit, another opportunity to contribute to Miss Lorna's welfare while receiving the less tangible benefits of purposeful connection to someone whose life mattered. "Thank you, Boone," Miss Lorna said as he prepared to leave. Words that had become part of their daily ritual. "Thank you, Miss Lorna," he replied. An exchange that acknowledged mutual gifts received and given. The piano music continued as Boone drove home through gathering twilight, its melodies carrying across the valley like a benediction on the day's activities. The sound represented more than one person's artistic expression. It was evidence of a community that had rediscovered its commitment to protecting and nurturing the individuals who contributed to its cultural life. Sarah's garden journal lay open on Boone's kitchen table, its pages now supplemented with his own notes about growing seasons and planting schedules. The journal had become a collaborative document, connecting past wisdom with present experience in ways that honored memory while embracing change. As he completed his evening routine, Boone reflected on the transformation that had occurred since that stormy morning when Blue had refused to let him pass by someone in need. He discovered that caring for others wasn't a betrayal of his love for Sarah. It was a continuation of values she'd spent years nurturing, expressed through circumstances she'd anticipated with remarkable foresight. The worn wedding ring still circled his finger, but it no longer felt like a barrier between him and the world. Instead, it had become a reminder that love, properly understood, expanded rather than contracted human capacity for connection. Sarah's memory lived not in isolation, but in service. Not in withdrawal, but in the willingness to risk caring about others, despite the vulnerability such caring required. In the distance, Miss Lorna's piano music continued, its notes carrying across the valley like a promise that beauty and community could survive even the most difficult circumstances when people chose to protect what mattered most.